let me begin by explaining how we ended up here and what we hope to accomplish today, and where we may go awry, although I don't think so. I think what Lucy and Chris are going to share with us in the next 45 minutes, hopefully will be eye-opening. Maybe for some of you, you'll be like, oh, we knew all that, but I don't think so. And then I want to make sure we have time at the end for an open, honest discussion. And, I warned Lucy that some of our Gen Z board members might very well disagree with some of the core theses here, and that would be healthy and appreciated. So don't feel anyone like you should hold back. So with that, Lucy, Christoph, take it away. Glad you're here.
Thank you so much. Lovely to meet you all. My name is Lucy Farey-Jones. I am originally from England. My feed today, though, is beaming into you from San Francisco. I'm a strategist by trade, and I'm the founder of Register, which is a strategic design consultancy based in San Francisco, but we work with clients all over the world. And Christoph is my business partner. And we did this presentation, and I think Steve maybe sent it in the meeting invite, so I don't want to belabor the point, but it was genuinely born out of a frustration that I was feeling at my own dinner table, because I'm a mom to a 16-year-old non-binary kid and a 14-year-old girl. And I was struggling at dinner. I was finding that I was putting my foot in my mouth and saying the wrong thing and being told repeatedly, Mom, you can't say it like that anymore. And I remembered how I felt when my mom would say things that were just so out of tune. And I thought, I'm not going to go quietly. I refuse to be relegated to, like not understanding this generation. I want to lean in and really try and understand what is so different for them. And so this was started as a sort of pet project for me to try and get my head around my own kids. But then, of course, I realized we're in marketing, right? So this is the next generation of customers. And so most of my clients need to understand these anyway. So we've been lucky enough to present this deck to people like Amazon and Airbnb and all sorts of folks. And I love that what you said, Steve. It's certainly not. It's not perfect. And actually, I'm really excited that there are Gen Zers on this call. And I would love if you felt if you felt the need, I would love to hear from you. Like, that's wrong, that's nonsense, you missed this big point. The one thing I will say, it's quite a long deck, and we will go fast. Christoph and I are fast presenters. So if you wouldn't mind holding your comments, Gen Zers, and all of you actually, for the end, that would be amazing. And I would look to this meeting to try and punch this up even further. So I'm in no way pretending my field guide here is perfect. It's just my personal odyssey to try and understand this generation. So with that, I will hand over to you, Christoph, to kick us off.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, my name is Christoph. It's lovely to meet you all over Zoom. And I am a millennial, admittedly. So one generation removed from Gen Z, but a vast difference, as we'll talk about in a moment. This presentation is an amalgamation of a ton of research done by these clever folks. We did also include some of our own research on AI and technology in particular, but know that we've pulled from really reputable sources to put this together. And generally, this is an exercise in understanding. So before you proceed, we're going to ask you to do two things. One is to practice the art of extreme empathy. Let's really dig in, look at things from the Gen Z perspective and try to understand the world as they see it. And the second is to be open to new ways of engaging, new ways of connecting, because Gen Z does those things very differently than past generations. And to connect with Gen Z, we have to do both of those in equal measure. So those two things are how we've divided today's presentation. Chapter 1 is longer than chapter 2, but that's because we have to understand Gen Z before we can hope to connect with them. So without further ado, let's dive into the art of extreme empathy for Gen Z. Steve, as you mentioned, it is difficult to define Gen Z, partially because they don't want to be defined. And Lucy's going to talk about that more in a moment. But broadly speaking, when we're talking about Gen Z, we're talking roughly about people born between 1995 and 2012, depending on which source you reference. So roughly between 10 and 27 years old at the moment. Gen Z is 1/5 of the US population, third largest population segment just by a hair, and the largest global population segment, which is noteworthy. They've been influenced by formative experiences, as all generations are, but theirs are pretty unique. COVID-19, we're going to spend some time on this, had a massive impact on this generation and continues to. Things like Sandy Hook were really influential. Marriage equality, President Obama's presidency, and the rise of populism have all shaped how Gen Z views the world.
Okay, I get the unenviable task of trying to define a generation that doesn't want to be defined. If you go to the next slide, you can see that they really don't want to be put in a box, and I totally appreciate that. I think it's really refreshing that they are challenging, the pigeonholed nature of the world. That said, the one thing that does unite them is their weird diversity, and that they are the most diverse generation to date. So we won't go into the minutiae of the data here, but you can see just visually how different this generation is from previous ones. Interestingly, we are one generation away from the minority becoming the majority. So generation Alpha, who's the next generation after Z, will be the first generation when the minorities are in the majority. So we're right at the tipping point with this generation. And unsurprisingly, therefore, they care deeply about diversity, which means, of course, if you're a professional trying to hire one of these, this generation, it's really important that your DEI work is real and not, lip gloss. As to identity, they're really a very different and quite highly complex generation. This is what I found from GLAAD, which is an excellent source. And it's a way for me to understand identity. And this was mainly where I was putting my foot in it at my dinner table. And so what I've come to understand is for this generation, gender identity and sexual identity are different. And they're very diverse and nuanced, and there's many layers to it. So I'm going to take you through one by one. So obviously the sexual identification is literally the gender that you're assigned by the doctor at birth. And this generation is very well versed in terms like AFAB and MFAB, which means, AFAB and AMAB, which means, assigned female at birth or assigned male at birth. And that is all it is. It's just literally your base sex. And then on top of that, you layer on gender identity. So the gender you were assigned isn't always the same as the gender with which you identify for this generation. Theirs is not this binary world that I grew up in, man versus woman, but it's a very nuanced spectrum as evidenced by all the vernacular above. And again, I'm not going to go through each and every definition. I did this again so that I would have it, so that when my kids reference, their gender queer, I could see what they were talking about. But again, it's certainly a very different era than mine. I'm a Gen Xer. And a further layer down is gender expression, which is how you choose to present yourself to the world. And I think what I found fascinating, and again was very helpful for me, was for this generation, transgender doesn't mean what it meant in my generation. It's now an umbrella term for anyone whose gender identity and or expression is different from the one they were assigned at birth. And so even those in transition, which is definitely a phrase these guys use, it doesn't necessarily mean that they've physically changed sex. It could be you're socially transitioning, you're legally transitioning, or you're medically transitioning. So again, transgender has got a much different, deeper meaning for this generation. So when it comes to generation, where's the gender, this generation is 4 times more likely to be genderqueer than Gen X and twice as likely than Gen Y. And 1/3 of them know someone who uses they, them pronouns. And which means the majority of them are very frustrated by forms that make you tick male or female, which I think is really, that's going to change for sure. They're very flexible in how they think about gender in general. Sometimes even on a given day, they change how they approach and how they manifest. I'll let you read that quote. And then on the next slide, you'll see there's actually from my kids' school. Some high schoolers are choosing to wear different colored jewelry or shirts or bracelets, depending on how they're feeling that day. So they can change their gender day to day. And even Harvard's on board, right? They've made it very clear that it's okay to have different genders day to day. So we've kind of dealt with the first layer here with gender. Let's move on to sexual orientation, because again, this is a separate level for these people. So long gone are the days of the binary choice of straight or gay. There's a much more nuanced word, and once again, the terms are very many and varied. And this generation is extremely fluent in all of them. I mean, my kid at the age of 12 would come home and say, "Oh yeah, I've decided I'm pansexual," and they have a very clear understanding of what that means. They know where their friends will identify on this spectrum, and they all talk openly about it. Next slide. 1 in 5 of this generation identify as LGBTQ, and it's 18% globally. So again, much stronger percentage than those who said they identified earlier. I suspect a lot of that is it's, you know, less, I mean, it's still hard to come out, but I think it was harder in previous generations. But I think what's super interesting is even beyond those who have already identified, a further, I think it's 10% are open to dating other genders. So again, it's not fixed for this generation. And when you look at a deep dive on the LGBTQ group, they're in command of their pronouns. So 1 in 4 use pronouns that fall outside of the binary construction of gender. So they, them, or other neo-pronouns. So next level, I'm nearly there. Romantic orientation is different than sexual orientation for this generation, which again is a nuance that definitely wasn't around when I was growing up. So again, understanding you can have certain sexual orientation, but then you'll have a romantic orientation too. So you could be panromantic, polyromantic, biromantic. And again, we can leave all these terms with you, but it was important for me to get them all down. So net, for this generation, an introduction might read something like this. Hi, nice to meet you. I'm Terry. My pronouns are they, them. I'm an AMAB, but I identify as non-binary, and I have socially and legally transitioned. I'm androgynous, pansexual, and grey romantic. How would you like me to refer to you? And I have heard my kids actually ask that. It's a very polite generation, and they absolutely want to get it right with each other. So I know that section was long, and I apologize for it, but that is what I learned on my little odyssey around trying to understand the things that I was putting my foot in over the dinner table.
Awesome.
Christoph gets the easy subject of education.
Yeah, let's move on to the slightly less complex subject of education. When you look at global data from 2019, this generation tends to be really highly educated internationally. There's a really high percentage of people enrolled in tertiary education. And of course, because Gen Z is between the ages of 10 to 27, a lot of them aren't college aged yet, but you can imagine that a high percentage of them will go into that level of education because they are in fact on track to be the most educated generation of all time. Among 18 to 21-year-olds no longer in high school, surveyed in 2018, 57% of Gen Zers were in college, which far outpaced millennials at the same time. And that's partially because so many Gen Zers have a parent who has a bachelor's degree. So this runs in the family. It's becoming increasingly normal to go to college. That said, Gen Z is dealing with this massive issue that millennials face too, which is growing student loan debt. It's extremely expensive to be a university student these days. And even though they're young already, a huge percentage of Gen Zers have delayed a major financial decision as a result of their student loan debt. 1 in 4 roughly said that they've put off having kids, and just under 1 in 5 said that they've delayed marriage because of student loan debt. And I think in part due to that reality, so many of them are open to alternative paths to education. So only about 1 in 4 Gen Zers believe that the traditional 4-year college model is the only pathway to getting a good job. Only about half of those polls said they're likely to pursue a 4-year plan. And I think that's in large part because they're self-learners and they have access to these resources that no generation before them has really had access to from a young age. So if you ask a Gen Zer, hey, when you want to learn something new, what do you use? Google YouTube. It's number 1, number 2, always. And that comes before friends and family, before teachers, before courses, before everything that traditionally would have represented the way that you learn things. And because of that, they're also really keen on alternative learning styles. So far fewer Gen Zers like to learn by listening in a traditional classroom lecture or even by reading course materials. They like to learn by doing. And more and more today, immersive technology enables people to have experiences where they can learn by touching and feeling things in the digital space. And, you know, honestly, when we ask ourselves, like, have you ever seen a Gen Zer pause to read an instruction manual? Probably not. They're going to go on YouTube and watch a video about it or some other way of immersing themselves. And what all this demographic data adds up to is a generation that is fiercely unapologetic. This is an amazing article, resonated strongly with me as a millennial, and I highly encourage you to read it. It's called The 37-Year-Olds Who Are Afraid of the 23-Year-Olds That Work for Them. And in that article, there are a ton of examples, but basically, it's about Gen Zers not being afraid to speak their feelings in the workplace. So it was always the Gen Zers getting the most vulnerable by speaking about partners cheating on them or the loneliness of a solo quarantine. They celebrate human emotion. They're unafraid to voice their truths, take mental health days, and so on. This is the reality of Gen Z. And as a millennial, I think it's important to divide millennials and Gen Zers for a moment because they are quite different. I was honestly super surprised by a ton of what we're presenting today. So millennials, we see emojis as whimsical little symbols to throw into a text when we feel like it. Whereas Gen Z, they use emojis professionally. It's a huge part of how they communicate. We'll talk more about that later. Millennials are known for their wanderlust, take time off to travel. Gen Zers have normalized taking time off for mental health. That's become normal today, and it certainly used to be stigmatized. Millennials, although we were known early on for being a little bit cheeky when we entered the workforce, have mostly fallen in line with following the rungs of the corporate ladder. Gen Zers, we read countless articles where a Gen Zer in their first month of joining a company would assign a task to the CEO of the company on Asana. They're just unafraid to do stuff like that. They don't see those traditional rungs as things they need to fall in line with. Millennials are used to hustling following the 2008 financial crisis, and Gen Zers are used to working, living, interacting, learning remote due to COVID-19, and generally being more individualistic and empowered to be on their own. Really important to note is that this generation has more ways of communicating than any generation ever has. They are smartphone native. They grew up with smartphones, and they probably have 20 different ways to get in touch with you. And because there is so much communicating going on, they have this really unique style of doing that. It's crisp writing, it's abbreviations, it's acronyms, emojis to convey sentiment, and they carry that with them across forms of communication, whether they're completely casual or professional. So you see things emerging in the workforce where Gen Z is using emojis and things to communicate. Also, millennials were kind of known for popularizing this idea of having a side hustle in addition to your day job. Gen Z has said, screw that. Let's make the side hustle the thing. The project that I'm passionate about, I want that to be my career. And we'll talk about this in a moment, but it's incredible the number of them that are using online tools to create a career for themselves. And even colleges, prominent colleges like Duke and USC and UVA have started to offer classes on how to build successful social media enterprises. You've probably heard this term, quiet quitting. Gen Z and millennials have really popularized this. It's not actually quitting. It doesn't involve quitting your job. It means doing the amount of work that you're paid to do. And again, Gen Z has very much normalized getting to a healthier work-life balance, especially in the era of being always on. They know technology can be dangerous, and they are pushing back against answering emails from their boss at 10 p.m. COVID had an interesting effect on Gen Z. I think millennials were historically known as kind of the real wanderlust generation, but Gen Z, in being stuck in place during COVID, certainly recognized that freedom is a bit fleeting. So now increasingly they're starting to travel. And I mentioned the statistic at the bottom here just a second ago, but this number absolutely blew me away. 1 in 4 members of Gen Z want to be social media influencers for their career, 25%. So you can imagine that being fluent in social, being fluent in all these forms of communication is super advantageous for that, but also travel and social influence go hand in hand, and they always have. Because of how many forms of output Gen Z has access to, they feel that they're more creative than previous generations, and they're significantly more likely to do something creative every day compared to other generations. They really pride themselves on their creativity, and they utilize all these tools they have at their disposal to come up with creative stuff. Stuff like this. This one kind of felt like a gut punch to me because it makes fun of millennials, but I'll play it for you.
Tired of boomers bunching Gen Z and millennials together, because I personally don't want to be associated with people who still think that Harry Potter movies are a personality trait.
Don't really know what that means, but I like Harry Potter, so ouch. It's pretty interesting looking at the general aesthetic that Gen Z has leaned into. And this article that we found in the New York Times is really great. They love denim. They love things like Stranger Things. And you wonder why. And the New York Times has pinned it on they're yearning for an age before the dominance of social media and technology. So before this constant connectivity, everyone wore jean everything. And so they're starting to trend in that way, which is interesting. And from our own research, we've seen the same trend. So if you look at this light blue box at the bottom of this chart here, you see steadily increasing generation by generation, the tendency to be an early adopter or an innovator persona who tries new technology before others do, until you get to Gen Z, where it drops off and is almost level with their parents' generation of Gen X. That's probably in part because they've grown up immersed in technology, and they know that there are positives to it, but also negatives to it. Speaking of that, when we asked the question in our research, would your life be better? And this was conducted last year. So would your life be better if you lived in 2122 or now in 2022? Millennials, super optimistic, 60% of them roughly saying, of course, 100 years from now will be better, more innovation, more everything, it'll be better. Gen Zers are not optimistic at all. Fewer of them think that it'll be better in 21, 22 than it is now. And you have to account for the fact that they're growing up barraged by media, which is often filled with a lot of negativity. The political climate, the actual climate, all sorts of things are going on that make it hard to be optimistic if you're a young person. And you have to give Gen Z credit because they don't use social media the way that we all do. And that's true of a couple different things, but in particular, I just kind of scroll aimlessly. Gen Zers know how to bend the algorithms in their favor. They'll like things, they'll comment on things on purpose to train the algorithms within social media apps to show them content that they're interested in. They really are clever about knowing how to do that. And they know the dangers of social media. We'll talk about that more in a moment. But by doing that, they can curate their feeds to not be as negative, to not show them things that they feel they need to buy, but don't actually need.
Thanks, Christoph. So I'm going to help make the turn. We talked about there's a two-part to this presentation. This is the final part of the empathy. And I guess no presentation on Gen Z could be complete without just tackling head-on the subject of the pandemic, because that's had an indelible impression, sadly, on this generation in the form of stress. So the pandemic stressed us all, but this generation more than most. If you could advance, please, Christoph. 1 in 4 of them reported feeling more emotionally distressed. 64% of those in Europe are at risk of depression. And as you guys know, the Surgeon General has warned of the inner pandemic that is coming. And this is very, very sad and quite alarming. Again, if you look at the next slide, the stats are, such that COVID made it hard just to have fun. So it put a stop to the very normal activities of being a teen. So pushing away from your parents, finding your group, all of that was not possible in COVID, and it has had disastrous results because rather than roaming the mall or hanging out with friends, teens were all forced, like we all were, to go inside or just jump online. So of course, during the pandemic, they did all of these things, much like everybody did, but they did more of them. And there's, obviously there's some positives to that. They had fun on TikTok, and TikTok is definitely the app of choice for this generation. And they certainly, there's some lighthearted fun to be had there. And so what we pulled here were 3 of the top 10 memes of 2020. I don't think we have time to play all of them, but Christoph, you may pick the one you want to play. And play
M to B it is.
Oh God. Okay.
B, M to the B's, M to the B, it's M to the B, it's M to the B.
I have no idea what that means, but apparently it's funny. It's the #1 viral video in 2020. But of course, as you guys know, I'm talking to the Sustainable Media Center here, there was a very dark side to social media, and it's been a huge problem for this generation. It's extremely depressing. So, 74% of those who identify as LGBTQ say they have encountered homophobic content on social media. And they're, of course, suffering from massive levels of depression. 53% of American girls were exposed to at least one form of weight stigmatization, and we've seen a massive increase in hospitalization due to, anorexia. And this is not just an American phenomenon. We see it in Europe, and then even in Japan, we're seeing horrible suicides. The rates increasing is terrifying, and it's a real scourge. And I think we're just seeing the tip of it right now. Like, I reckon a lot of this is emergent, and we're going to see, a terrible, consequence of what those 2 years of, isolation did for this generation. So I'm sorry to be the one. I always get the downer sections. Let me lift us up and talk about, well, this is about distrust, but there's a little glimmer of hope at the end. We are very interested at Register in the level of trust across generations. So things that people trusted in the boomer years are not necessarily trusted by this generation. So what I mean by that is, when engaging with organizations and institutions, Gen Z leads with skepticism. They operate on the belief that trust should be earned, not assured. And you can see this in the data reflected in the next chart. So when it comes to government, both local and national governments are mistrusted by this generation. And this study, by the way, was a study we found that had been done just after the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade. So I'm sure some of the numbers reflect that. But you can see how different this generation is to the previous ones. What's interesting is this generation is, of course, like many of the young generations before them, more likely to identify as liberal. But even the Republicans in Gen Z, next slide, believe that they think government should take on a bigger role in fixing things. So this generation wants more from government than they're currently doing. Next slide. When it comes to religion, so more than a third of them are religiously unaffiliated. Again, you can see, just looking at the colors there, how different that is to previous generations. And second chart there, they don't believe that it's necessary to have a religion to raise children, which I think is super interesting and very different. The next slide is for them, again, as we said at the top of this section, trust is not a given, it must be earned. And it couldn't be more different from the boomer generation. It's almost the obverse. But they do believe, this is sort of the silver lining, they do believe that brands could make a difference. So 57% of this generation agree with the statement. In many cases, brands can do more to solve social ills and societal problems than governments, because I think they've grown up in an era of gridlocked Congress, and they've seen time and time again initiatives fail. And so I think they look at brands as a way to potentially shortcut that nonsense that's happening with the partisan divide. And they have some hope that perhaps brands can help make a difference. So that is the end of our empathy section. We're tracking really well. It's 10:30. I think we can probably wrap this next section up in about 15 minutes, 20 minutes, maybe, Christoph?
I think that's right. Yep.
Because we're now flipping to great. We've sort of understood them, and I know we've got some things wrong, and I'm excited to hear from Gen Z on the call at the end of this, what we got wrong and what's missing. But we're now going to talk about, okay, well, how do you engage with this generation?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think the first rule of engagement really is that all content communicates. So a little quote here for you. For Gen Z, everything is content and all content communicates. Sharing a headline is a message, a photo is a vibe, a video is a mood. And for a generation which holds such complex, nuanced sentiment, as we said, they're more in touch with everything that's going on mentally and emotionally than any generation before them. These nonverbal but colorful mediums are required to get across what's felt. So let's look at content from words to emojis to grammar to memes and videos. Gen Z has more ways of communicating than any generation before them. So first, let's start here. How many of these words can you define? Anyone? Perhaps the Gen Zers on the call are laughing. I certainly didn't know what chuggy was, and the source here at the bottom is 50 Gen Z slang words you need to know to keep from becoming chuggy. So I was really worried that I was well on my way to becoming chuggy. That one in particular means something that is not at all trendy. So clearly I am not at all trendy. But it's super interesting. You know, every generation has their own language, and some of these are borrowed from other segments of culture and so on, of course. But Gen Z is very adept at speaking in their own way. And Lucy, even when I hear your children speak, sometimes I'm like, what did you say? Despite being a millennial, I have no idea. So one of the things that Gen Z does that's really interesting is use emojis in new ways. And they've really pioneered emoji speak. And one article that I think does a great job of explaining this is there was this woman who wasn't able to go to college right after high school. So she worked for 12 years and went back at age 30 and lived in the dorms with a bunch of Gen Zers. And she kind of put out this guide as to what different emojis mean. And so thumbs up is passive aggressive. So beware if you receive that. Upside down smiley face means F my life. This little bead of sweat smiley means I'm stressed but fine. And interestingly, eyeballs mean you're listening. That one caught me off guard. Another thing to note with Gen Z, and this is also a little true of my generation, I suppose, is that punctuation at the end of a sentence in a text message, in an email, can indicate anger to this generation. So if you say okay, period, to a Gen Zer, they might be like, what did I do? Just something to be aware of when you're communicating with Gen Zers. Memes. Memes are kind of the ultimate Gen Z communication style. Of course, it's an image, but it also has text. It has cultural context, really deep way of expressing an idea very quickly. So on social media, young adults are more likely to share a meme than a selfie or a photo of their food. Why is that? Because memes contain a ton of emotional information. Memes are embedded with cultural data that serve as a secondary message. interestingly, what's communicated is outsourced to a character. So it's kind of like, I'm not saying this, they are. And in addition, there's this collective experience of memes where everyone knows the reference. So there's a bit of, I'm not saying it, we are. And, you know, when everyone these days has the attention span of a goldfish, having a communication style like a meme that you can just send across and it has all these layers of meaning is really, really useful for this generation. So are memes nonsense, or are they deeply self-aware? Yeah, but probably both. And the one that stood out to me on this page is top right. You know, when someone from Gen Z finds an expensive product that will never benefit themselves in any way, I'll take your entire stock, with the funny warped face there. You know, memes are just a really interesting way to get ideas across. We found a video by a YouTuber named Mr. Sweet, which gave the rules of Gen Z humor, which I think is worth spending a minute on. So if it's popular, it's not funny. If it was popular, it's funny. If it's ironic, it's funny. If it makes no sense, it's funny. And of course, if it's not funny, it's funny. It's worth noting that for Gen Z, often the things that are mainstream are just not as cool as the things that are a bit more fringe. Apps are Gen Z's preferred mode of expression. And you'll notice the list has shifted around a little bit since millennials. On the right, Facebook has dropped down quite a bit. TikTok is certainly number one. But interestingly, at the bottom, 9 and 10 are immersive online video game type experiences. And a lot of Gen Zers have community that's based in these digital worlds. Gen Zers are way more likely to follow online celebrity and meme accounts than any other generation, including millennials, by quite a wide margin. And they really love things like fundraising YouTubers like Mr. Beast. This guy's so successful, it will blow your mind. And honestly, the gap between celebrities and influencers online is shrinking. And it's kind of hard to tell, like, is this person an actor, an actress? Are they an online influencer? What do they do? And an example of that is Emma Chamberlain. There's a video here, which I don't think we have time to play, but she started YouTubing at age 16, I believe. And by age 20, she was a Louis Vuitton brand partner at the Met Gala here. She had her own coffee company and she had a podcast, in addition to millions of followers on all of her social media platforms. It's pretty impressive that you can take YouTubing and expand it into a huge career like that in such a short amount of time. One form of social media that's really interesting that we wanted to call out is an app called Be Real. Be Real tries to push back against the inauthentic experience of social media. And just to harp on that for a moment, I think millennials are very guilty of this, but it's sort of using social media as the highlight reel of life, where only the best things are included. And of course, everything is always perfect. And that therefore, when you go on social media, it makes you feel really bad if you're having a bad day or you don't happen to be on vacation in Paris or what have you. Gen Zers, on the other hand, prefer this kind of unscripted imperfection. So Emma Chamberlain, who I was just telling you about, who's a Louis Vuitton partner and so on, millions of followers, just posts a picture that says eye infection. And people appreciate that because it's true and it's real. And Be Real, as I was just alluding to, is an app that really encourages that. It'll prompt you at a random time during the day and give you 2 minutes to take a video or a photo out of the front camera of your phone and out of the selfie camera. So I'm sure some people still curate their Be Reals, but it gives you less of a chance to think about it for 3 hours and Photoshop it and everything else that other apps do. That's just a 15-second video on Be Real. And those things are gaining popularity because Gen Z demands authenticity. They don't want that fake highlight reel life that other generations have leaned into. They think there's way too much pressure to be perfect on social. They think people should show more of their real lives on social. They're more likely to trust someone if they know that they're a real human and that they struggle, and they care a lot less than past generations about impressing other people on social media. So things have really changed in terms of how this generation is looking at social media, and that has had a huge effect on how they view brands.
Thanks, Christoph. And I think what's really interesting is, do you remember that stat at the end of my last section where I told you that 57% of this generation believe that brands can do more than governments to solve societal ills? Well, the answer is the truth is they can, but right now, next slide, only 8% of them are feeling that the brands really understand their generation. So there's a massive understanding gap, and there's a huge opportunity in this authenticity point, because transparency is the only way for this generation. So they don't necessarily distinguish between the ethics of a brand, the company that owns it, and its network of partners and suppliers. So a company's actions must match its ideals, and the ideals must permeate the entire stakeholder system. Because guess what? You can't hide anything from this generation. They're extremely resourceful. Remember, they can bend the algorithm. They can also find the information they need, and they can verify how a company is behaving in the world. So what this means is Generation Z expects brands to have a bigger why that inspires them to align with the brand. So what is the brand's purpose in the world beyond making money? And 50% of them say, look, I've called out a brand that behaved in a way that I thought was unethical. And that means that for brands in this era, there's sort of two contradictory forces that they have to deal with. So number one is the brand has to project a future world that the Gen Z can be part of and can support. Like, does it build to a more positive future? But does it also reflect their identity today? Does it reflect who they are? And is consuming this brand going to match with their internal feeling of their identity? So it's quite hard to be a brand that Gen Z has affection for, but when it's done well with transparency, it can work really well. We found this really interesting list from, I forget where we got it from, to be perfectly honest, but it was pretty cool. It was a list of the top 50 brands, and one thing that struck me is just how these top 10 lists or top 50 lists aren't necessarily the whole story, because we know that yes, Amazon's very well used by everybody. But again, with this generation, they're very well aware of Amazon's worker rights or lack thereof. And they're critical of Amazon for that reason. And we all know Chick-fil-A has been really vilified by this generation because of its anti-LGBTQ stance. And then even Glossier, who was the darling of the millennials, has fallen victim to some rumors of internal racism, and so therefore has been called out by this generation too. And none of those things are reflected in this snapshot of the best brands of 2021. So again, I think the authenticity means that things move faster, and real-time information affects companies' standings. So what this means is, in contrast to previous generations, they're looking for uniqueness, not exclusivity. They're not looking for this polished, finalized product that's on a pedestal. They're looking for access, and they're looking for brands to customize and reflect their own identity and be much more unique than ever before. So for marketers, which are our clients, we talk to them about, hey, you need to market with this generation, not at. So it's not about, speaking your truth to your, broadcasting about your product. It's about getting the generation to market with you, and actually beyond marketing, be ready to co-create product with this generation. Many brands are appealing to this generation by offering co-creation in the form of extreme customization. And I know all too well how clever Converse is at extracting money from my kids to stitch their own stitching and pick their own, color and put their own logo on a shoe. And it's pretty cool. It's a very different way of transacting than, again, when we grew up, just bought it off the shelf. So for this generation, it's not always be closing, it's always be creating. So in order to be making a sale, brands have to stay creative, and they have to be open to doing something unique and authentic and different every time.
Awesome. Thanks, Lucy. So this brings us to the end of the presentation. We hope we've presented some things that were surprising, interesting on both these chapters. And honestly, we see this as a continuous journey. So please, we'd love to open the floor for discussion, to hear any thoughts that any of you have. And yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to present this to you.
Thank you. That was actually great. Can we get copies of the slides?
Yeah, sure.
So I'll take moderator's prerogative and ask Lucy a question to begin. So Lucy, you went on this journey to solve a problem at your family dinner table. How did you do?
I'm doing better. And my elder one, the non-binary one, is actually much more understanding and forgiving of me than my younger one. My younger one holds me accountable and is always telling me when I slip up. But now I sort of have it. I'll still use the wrong word, but then I'll go, oh, that's wrong. Sorry, I meant this. So it's a slow burn, and I'm getting there. But yeah, I think I know they admire me and they respect me, and they're thankful that I'm trying, because they say a lot of parents don't even try. So I think I get credit for trying. It's funny, as I'm presenting, I'm aware of how old I sound, and definitely never going to be fluent. And so I really want to hear from the Gen Zers on the call, if there are any. Sorry, I can't quite see who's on the call because I know that I've got a lot of it wrong. But yeah, it is a loop for me. I keep learning and keep messing up.
All right, we have 15 minutes. Let's jump in. But so we have parents on the call, we have Gen Z on the call, we've got people that work with Gen Z on the call. We have a great big mix of different people. And I'm just curious to whoever wants. I could ask. Yeah, go ahead.
I can kick it off. As a Gen Z on the call, I'm 19. I will say I'm surprised with how good that was, really. Like, it was actually compared to like all of the talks I've been to about this, like they do seem pretty like out there. But I thought this was very good. There were like a couple things that I noted that I'm not gonna like really go into. But one of the things that just really stuck out to me and that I've been seeing recently is I think it's because of the pandemic, like especially with myself, there's now a trend of like a cozy or quiet life, which is anti-technology, like pushing against the status quo. So like this week on TikTok, a lot of the videos that I've seen are people showcasing like the fact that their Instagram account only has 20 followers as opposed to, thousands. There's people that are posting like the fact that in their thread of like messages on an iPhone, the most recent messages are from 1, 2, 3, 4 days ago instead of getting, messages every single hour, just to show that like I'm not using technology, I'm actually existing in the real world, which I think is an interesting thing to see, especially being so overloaded with technology during the pandemic. And then the other like last piece that wasn't necessarily covered that I think has been very interesting, especially me like entering a college environment recently, is how different relationships are among Gen Zers. I think that like the word that a lot of people use is a situationship, where it's not a relationship, it's not marriage, it's situationship. Yeah, and like I thought of that a lot with like the nuances of emojis that you were talking about. Like that same thing exists with relationships where like I'll walk into my dining hall and like see a friend, and that friend will talk to me for 20 minutes about 2 text messages that they got from like a potential love interest, trying to deconstruct exactly what every emoji, letter, capital letter, lowercase, punctuation means, and classify it as, oh, are they a situationship? Are they actually going to ask me like, what is this? That's just one other piece that I think would be interesting if you all want to do some research on.
Thank you, Connor. That's amazing. Is a situationship a relationship or a potential relationship?
It's a whole separate thing. It's like I don't even know the like correct words to describe it. It's like I don't even know. It's like more than a friend with benefits, which is like a word that people have used, but it's less than like, I'm not going to call you my boyfriend, girlfriend, partner. It's like somewhere in the middle.
That's cool.
Very complicated.
Very
even
helpful
for me.
We'll dig into that. That's an awesome word. Thank you, Connor.
By the way, every generation obsesses over messaging from someone that they're romantically. Just you guys have different things you obsess over. Like the emojis are different, but we all have that.
Yeah.
Does he like me? Thank you for that. That was helpful.
David.
I found it fascinating and interesting in a number of ways. Sort of a combination of, oh, this is a natural extension of society. This is where things have been trending, since the silent generation through boomers and on. A fair bit of that being, okay, this is, hey, we're all good liberal progressives, and this is the way things should be. It's much more woke, using the original good sense of woke than the bastardized sense of woke. And that's logical, rational, and we're heading in the right direction. Some of it seems to me to be just immaturity. I mean, realistically, the oldest age of people we're talking about is in their early 20s. Some of this stuff seems to be things that could have been true of Gen Xers and millennials and boomers back when they were that age. Trying just to be different for the sake of being different, being counter, previous generation for the sake of that. doing nonsensical memes because that was in and cool as opposed to whatever. So I think that I read less into that and think of that's less important, because I think that was true for most generations. But what I see here generally, and on the sad side, depressing side, the fact that there is so much angst, there is clearly more angst now in the generation than there was in the boomers or the silent generation. They are growing up in the silent generation lived in a clean, simple world if you happen to be a dead white male, and everybody else didn't count. So that was, everybody was a shared, best of times kind of thing. But even so now what we're seeing is a much more inclusive world across the entire board. And so the definition of our world, the definition of a generation has, if you said in the 1950s, what does a generation look like? It would have looked like white male, patriarchal, cishet, so on and so forth. Now the world consists of people of a wide variety of things. And so therefore the reactions to it are what you'd expect in a society with a wide base. And so I see this as basically an interesting, good thing. And probably the biggest takeaway here is that the generation really believes in authenticity. Authenticity, quote unquote, is something that has become, it sort of started, it started with the boomers a little bit, and it's clearly millennials were more, and so now we're seeing that the question of authenticity and reality and artisanal and stuff opposed to manufacture is really interesting, and is a logical progression here. And the one thing that I find a little weird and slightly disturbing is the influencer question. And for our old people's generation, an influencer is somebody who had influence because they had done something to warrant having influence. They were an expert, they were whatever, they had experience, right? Now, to be an influencer it's like being, famous for being famous kind of thing. And so therefore, the extent to which Gen Z is relying on influencers as opposed to people with, now maybe there's too much reliance in the past on credentials, but if you rely on if you throw out all credentials with the bathwater and you say, I don't listen to Fauci because he's got credentials or he's a scientist, and I want to listen to influencers like Bobby Kennedy or whatever it is, I see a problem with that. But other than that, I found this ultimately fascinating and very interesting and logical, and it sort of rings true to me.
Hey, can I just ask a question? This is terrific, by the way. I believe that I might be a stand for this research. If I got that right, I'd give you a thumbs up. I think that might not be good though. So I need to dig back into it. No, but it was really great. I had one question for you, which was if you noticed any geographical trends, if some of this resonates more, for example, on the coasts than in the middle of the country, or if big cities, small city, Florida versus California. I imagine there are some differences there. Just curious what you noticed.
I wish I could give you a nuanced answer. I was not able to find much data that broke it down that way, but I'm pretty sure you're exactly right. Like, I bet you that it's very polarized in terms of coastal elites versus the middle of the country.
Mm-hmm.
We did try and dig into like Republicans versus Democrats. But yeah, I think that this is not reflective of everybody, obviously. Sorry, we couldn't find much more than just national data. So I think it would be a good study to do, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So Lucy, a bunch of the people in this organization are interested in how young people consume news, where they get information from, how they differentiate between, performance and information. Any observations there?
Just anecdotal to me. I think TikTok is the source of news, but I would ask Connor. He's right here. How do you get your news?
Now that I'm in college and get the New York Times for free, I get the New York Times. But I think I'm a bit of an old soul with that. I would say mostly Twitter and TikTok. Yeah. And Instagram.
Are you on Threads yet, or are you not touching that?
I downloaded it just to see what it looked like, but I think I'm getting to the point where maybe I'm getting too old for things, because I looked at it and just had no desire to learn how to use it or like the nuances of it and just deleted it. But I don't know. We'll see.
Don't say that, Connor. You'll make us all feel really old.
Oh, man.
No, that's fantastic. And yeah, I mean, anecdotally from my generation, the best place to get up-to-date news on an event that's unfolding in real time is certainly Twitter. Anytime there's a natural disaster or anything where I live in Boulder, Colorado, that's what we go to see what's going on. Yeah.
My kid has BBC on her Instagram, which is hilarious. That's how she gets the news. And I was like, what? But apparently she follows the BBC and gets alerts in the form of pictures. And I'm like, all right, cool. Like, I'm happy with it because I'm like, yeah, BBC, good. Good source.
So I see that Lori's joined us back. Lori, I'm curious as to how those observations related to the Gen Zers that you work with.
So, like Connor said, I mean, I'm definitely not a Gen Zer, but I feel like I'm around them, often enough to I don't put my foot in my mouth because I just kind of keep quiet now and I just sort of lurk because I definitely am afraid of like making those mistakes. And I also, I have like twin Gen Z. I have 3 children who are Gen Zers and, a 10-year-old who hangs out with them a lot. So she's almost more Gen Z than I am. But like, I don't know, I find that like, I think I find that like, as long as you show that you like care about trying to understand, I think it's the same thing that you said, like, as long as like my daughter, is gay, she's like getting married soon and things like that. And it's just like, we sort of got into a thing a while ago because it was like, she was like, you don't ask about my life and you don't like do these things and you don't do these things. But like, for me, it was like, I'm kind of afraid to ask about the life because sometimes it's like, I don't know what I should be asking. Like, should I be treating it like it's just regular or if it's not regular? But like, I found that like, as I said, I think the biggest thing is like, as long as I try to ask questions, it tends not to be, it's not like stressful. It's just like, just ask the question, like find the appropriate time, I guess, to ask the question. And as long as you're trying to understand, sometimes they'll make like merciless fun of me, but it's just like fun. But I think it's just like, ask the questions. So I find they're also like super like willing to educate you. I guess I'll just tell this story. Like when I first came to Pittsburgh, the first time that I came across like the word non-binary, it wasn't that long ago. We had our first editor-in-chief from Squirrel Hill. That's the first time I heard the term. And it was maybe 6 years ago. And just the whole like the grammar thing. And at first I was like, I can't use they, like, we can't do that. Like, what if we're talking about one person and then a group of people, then another, in singly, but then it's just like, you just get used to it, like with help. That's what I found. Like, editorially, it's like, we just got used to things because like, I found Gen Zers are certainly like willing to like educate you and show you the right way to do things if you're just giving them the voice anyway. So
before we run out of time, Connor, I want to make sure to talk about teens and mental health, Gen Z and mental health, because it's an area you care deeply about, and that the data around that was profoundly disturbing. Like, and it does, and I guess what I wonder about, Connor, in terms of work that we can do collectively with young people, like, is it just a trend that we can solve for, or is it an inevitability? Like, where do you come down on that?
Yeah, it's a really tough question, even for me. Like, theoretically, I have every tool. I know everything about like, oh, social media is bad and like mental health is important, but I find myself like not being able to get off my phone. Like, it has me. And it's just like, if it's getting me, I wonder what it's doing to people that don't have the resources and tools that I have and have had to, find this stuff out. I would just say that I think we will get to a point where it becomes too much. I think the VR thing that's becoming new, like the headset that Apple released, might be a turning point for a lot of people where they're like, wait, we are not existing in the real world anymore. Let's like take a step back and not exist in virtual reality and these things. So I think that it will continue progressing, but then hopefully stop.
What about any of the apps, any of the talk apps or any of the column apps? Any of that help?
I don't see that apps like that will continue to become bigger. I think that was a big thing during COVID, and a necessity during COVID, like having something like Discord to talk with friends and like even like FaceTime, like and Zoom, talking with people all the time. But now that the restrictions are lifting and we can exist in the real world again, I don't see that becoming like the pervasive thing over like traditional interactions.
Lucy, Christoph, it's funny, as we put this together, I crossed my fingers that it was as good as I thought it was. And it was, and by the way, as much as the Dex as a standalone is a great read, you're telling the story and the journey that you guys share is really valuable. So on behalf of everyone, thank you guys very much.
Thanks so much.